Hey, good morning.
Good morning, Dr. Levine. Can you hear me?
Ken, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. You do not. I'm off camera at the soundboard, so you cannot see my face. But I'm Matt. I was emailing you the Zoom link, but I'm
Nice
glad.
to talk to you, Matt.
We are very happy for you to be here. We're going to get started in just a few moments, and we will pass everything back to Charles and Alan, who will be leading everything. Do you have any questions before we get started?
I do not.
Right, perfect.
Thank you. Everything work okay? All right, folks. All right, Dave, ready to go. All right, good morning, all. You want to come in and have a seat? You're ready to go? Let's go. You want to whistle for me? All right, well, good morning, all. If you want to come in and take a seat, we'll get ready and proceed. All right, well, things are settling down here. I want to welcome you all to our final segment of this summer study series titled God Calling. What is God calling us to do? We have the honor and delight to have with us this morning Dr. Amy Jo Levine, who most of you know either through last year's visit with us or through her many books and studies that we have in our resource center. Let's just step back and recap where we are, what we've done this morning. And just to recap, all right, so we've acknowledged that our denomination, our society has gone through and is going through a period of discord, turmoil, and rapid change. But this period of discord, turmoil, and rapid change presents us at St. Stephen with an opportunity, right? Opportunity to step back together, listen to noted pastors, authors, and scholars as we try and discern together what God is calling us to do here on Sardis Road in Charlotte. So today we're going to take a look at the Last Supper, right? Very appropriate since most of us partook in that sacrament this morning in worship service, and consider what we as modern day disciples of Jesus can learn from Jesus' last meal with the original disciples before his arrest and crucifixion. So today, again, we've got Dr. Amy Jo Levine on Zoom with us. We welcome her. We'll examine the Last Supper based on Dr. Levine's 2018 book titled Entering the Passion of Jesus, a Beginner's Guide to Holy Week. Many of you have read this book, seen the video series. I can tell because this version has many highlights, markings, notes in the margin. So this is a well-used tome here in our resource center. And today's conversation will be a little bit different. As you can see, I've got my colleague, Alan Alsop here. We'll be working together this morning in our conversation with Dr. Levine. So let's introduce Dr. Levine. And you know her well, but let's go with a brief summary. Dr. Levine is the Rabbi Stanley M. Kessler Distinguished Professor of New Testament and Jewish Studies at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace in Hartford, Connecticut. She is also the Mary Jane Worthen University Professor of Jewish Studies and University Professor of New Testament Studies, Emerita at Vanderbilt University. As you know, Dr. Levine is a prolific author. Her books include Short Stories by Jesus, The Enigmatic Parables of a Controversial Rabbi, The Misunderstood Jew, The Church and the Scandal of the Jewish Jesus, The Gospel of Mark, and I believe she's got a new book coming out this fall, which is titled Jesus for Everyone, Not Just Christians. So that's an exciting title. And as you know, we've got a whole shelf in our resource center full of Dr. Levine's books and video studies. Dr. Levine received her BA degree from Smith College and her MA and PhD degrees from Duke University. And Dr. Levine was a guest during last year's summer study series, you may recall, in which we discussed her thoughts on the kingdom of heaven. So AJ, wanted to again have a very hearty welcome this morning to you. We're delighted to have you again with us here at St. Stephen during our summer study series. We're going to have two hosts, as I said, my colleague Alan Alsop and me, Charles Lansden. And Alan's got a few warm-up questions for you, AJ, before I delve into your thoughts on the Last Supper. So Alan?
Good morning, AJ.
Good morning. I'm so glad you started to call me AJ. All that Dr. Levine stuff I'm becoming apoplectic. I am a friend of y'all's. I'm a friend of your congregations. We need to be on a first name basis.
Absolutely. You know, you have a very large following here at St. Stephen, and we have studied a lot of your works, including in my Sunday school class. We also did a Bible study during Lent on your book, Entering the Passion of Jesus. And I don't know, I think the next step for you here is to form a fan club. Pretty sure. But I'm going to ask you a couple of questions because during our studies, I asked those participating, if you were to ask AJ a question, what would it be? And so I know you've heard these questions probably many times before, but inquiring minds want to know. So here's the first one. Growing up Jewish and practicing Judaism, why did you decide to become a New Testament scholar?
Well, my mother wanted me to be a lawyer. She said, you have a brain and a mouth, you ought to put them to work. And I said, I think I want to be a Bible professor. And she looked at me like something had gone wrong. But she was nevertheless supportive. The neighborhood where I grew up, and this is in southeastern Massachusetts. So if you've ever driven to Cape Cod, you probably drove past where I live and did not stop. The neighborhood was predominantly Portuguese Roman Catholic. The first person who registered to me as a Protestant, I met when I went to college. This is a very like small town parochial area. At the time, somewhat of a farming community. Now it's a Boston bedroom community. So I used to go to church with my friends. Going to church on Sunday morning was particularly fun because it got me out of Sunday school on Sunday morning, and church was only an hour and Sunday school was 3 hours. So I figured if I had a sleepover on Saturday night, I had a good deal the next day. I was intrigued by my friends' Roman Catholicism, praying the rosary at night, because all the families did that. In New Bedford, Massachusetts, which was the big town near where I grew up, there was this big festival in August called the Feast of the Blessed Sacrament that everybody went to, which was great fun. Like saints being paraded through the streets and priests who had these fabulous outfits. I thought nuns were really interesting. And since we all went to public school, we had whatever religious education we had happened after school or on the weekends. So I would go to Hebrew school in New Bedford in the next town, and my friends would go to their religious ed class in the local church. And then we get on the bus the next morning and, we talk about what we learned in religious ed. And it was like, you have Moses, we have Moses. You have David, we have David. And then they had all these other people that I had never heard of. And when I went to ask my parents, like, who is this Jesus person and who are all these Marys? Because they all seem to be, all the women seem to be named Mary. My parents explained to me that these were all Jewish people, that Christianity, which meant Roman Catholicism, was very much like Judaism. We worship the same God, the one who created heaven and earth. We say the same prayers like the Psalms. Everybody knew Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. We take authority from the same set of scriptures, whether it's Genesis or Isaiah, and that a Jewish man named Jesus and a Jewish woman named Mary, and here we're talking about Jesus' mother Mary, were very, very important. So my initial sense of Christianity was it was kind of like Judaism, same God, same books, a bunch of Jewish people. When I was in second grade, two major events happened. The first was that all of my friends are preparing to make what's called First Holy Communion, which is an initiation ritual in the Roman Catholic Church. I didn't know what the ritual was, but I knew you got a dress if you were a girl. You got this beautiful bride dress. And all of my friends had these great bride dresses. So I wanted a dress. So I announced to my parents, I need to make my First Holy Communion. I'm in it for the accessories. And my mother said, you can't because you're Jewish. And I said, but wait a minute, it's the same God and all these Jewish people. And my parents said, no. There are also some things that are distinct. So the closest I came to making my first communion, in fact, I took the dress out a couple of days ago. My mother bought my Barbie doll a bride dress. I still have the Barbie and I still have the dress. And when the new Barbie movie came out, which I haven't seen yet, but my daughter has, I took out my Barbie and put her in her bride dress. So there you go. That was 7. I'm now 67. So it gives you an idea of how long I've been holding on to this thing. That same school year, a couple of months later, a little girl said to me on the school bus, "You killed our Lord." And I said, "I didn't kill anybody." And she said, "Yes, you did. Our priest said so." So this was my first lesson in like interreligious dialogue, is that sometimes when somebody says something, we go on automatic and we don't have details. So we just invent stuff. So here's what I invented. I knew priests had to wear these special collars. And I thought the reason that priests had to wear these special collars was, were the priest to tell a lie, the collar would choke the priest, which I think is a really good idea for anyone in a clerical collar, right? This keeps you honest. So I said, is the priest dead? Because this had to be such a whopper of a lie. The collar would have choked the priest and he would have croaked. So she said, no. I, being a rational child, think the priest said I killed God. The collar didn't kill the priest. Therefore, by the transitive property of deicide, I must be guilty of killing God. I get off the school bus, early 1960s. I'm crying. My mother meets me at the bus and says, "What's wrong?" I said, "I killed God." The priest said I killed God. So it took my mom a little bit of time to figure out what had happened. When she did, she assured me that God was doing just fine, which to my 7-year-old heart was very, very good news. And as I found out later, she made a few calls to the local diocesan office. Something called Vatican II was already underway. But among the latest documents of Vatican II, this is a text called Nostra Aetate, which was promulgated in October of 1965. That text said that Jews at all times and places cannot be held responsible for the death of Jesus. And that created a sea change in Catholic religious education, which eventually filtered down into much Protestant and Eastern Orthodox religious education. But I came in before that, and I could not figure out how this tradition that had the same God and the same books and all these Jewish people, not to mention the bunny and Santa, because what's not to like, was saying horrible things about me. So I announced, you can probably tell I'm an only child. I announced to my parents that I was going to go to religious education class with my friends, because I had Hebrew school 2 days a week. They had church school another day. So since I was free that afternoon, I was going to go to church school with my friends. I was going to find out where this hateful teaching came from, and I was going to stop it. I thought it was a translation error, because in the afternoon after school, I went to something called Hebrew school. And in Hebrew school, you learn Hebrew. Nobody told me the New Testament was written in Greek. Plus, I'm only 7 years old. My parents, who were very, very wise, said, listen, go, you might learn something. As long as you remember who you are, pay attention. It's good to know about other people's religious traditions. So I went, and I like the stories. I mean, that's kind of what hooked me, because the sisters, the nuns, and then the lay teachers who were teaching us our catechism, our religious education class, they just basically told Bible stories. And the Bible stories that they told, which came from the Gospels, sounded very much like the stories I was hearing in Hebrew school that come from the Tanakh, or what you would call the Old Testament. And I kept going back and saying, well, I've heard this story before, but it ends differently. Like Jesus meets a woman at a well. I think they're going to get married. That turned out not to happen. That's John 4. And Jesus heals people and raises dead children, and so does the prophet Elijah, and so does the prophet Elisha. And Jesus tells stories, as you know, and the Jewish tradition is replete with stories. Jesus did not invent parables as a genre. Even Jesus' death reminded me of the death of the Maccabean martyrs. In the weird way the world works, the Roman Catholic Church got the books of the Maccabees, but Jews got the holiday of Hanukkah. So we know the stories, even though they're not in our scripture. And I kept going back because I like the stories. The nuns loved me because I'm the only kid who wants to be in religious education class after school. And I felt welcome. I never heard anything anti-Jewish. And I don't think the teachers were thinking, let's wait for the little Levine girl to go on vacation, or maybe one of those Jewish holidays in the fall, and then we'll do all the bad Jew stuff. I don't think they read that way. So that by the time I sat down and read the New Testament, I was maybe 14 or so, that I read it cover to cover. I had started a bunch of times. You get up to Paul and it's like, oh, please. But I finally got through. Two things occurred to me. One is I understood where that priest got his stuff, because you can read the New Testament and you get comments like the Jews who killed the Lord Jesus. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, or the synagogue of Satan in the book of Revelation, or in Matthew in chapter 27, where Matthew says, all the people say his blood be on us and on our children. And that's where you get that perpetual blood guilt. So I thought, well, you can read the New Testament and come out anti-Semitic, but you don't have to. And the reason I knew you didn't have to is because my Catholic teachers weren't. So I did not have the language for this then. The term would be hermeneutics. It's the art of reading and how we choose to read kindly and benevolently rather than with hate or with malevolence. So the first thing that occurred to me is there must be a trick here. There must be some sort of reading strategy. And if anybody can teach me what this is, I want to teach other people how they can read nicely rather than meanly. And the other thing that occurred to me was it was all Jewish history. And it was Jewish history that I didn't get in the synagogue, because we've got no sacred scripture from the first century in the synagogue. The last book in the text that we share is probably the book of Daniel, which dates around the year 165 or so before the time of Jesus. And then in the synagogue, like magic, we flip over to rabbinic literature, the Mishnah, which was written down about the year 200. So I thought if I want to know something about first century Judaism, along with the Jewish historian Josephus and a few other sources, the New Testament's the best text that I've got. And if I want to know something about women in the Galilee, the New Testament is the best text that I've got. So I thought, well, if anybody will teach me how to do this, I want to do New Testament as Jewish history, and I want to do New Testament in terms of Jewish-Christian relations so we don't bear false witness against each other. So I went off and I majored in religion, and then I got a PhD from Duke. And each time I thought, if this isn't going to work, I'm going to go to law school. But it worked. So law school's still out there as a possibility, but less likely these days.
Thank you, AJ. We don't have time for any more questions, but
I'm sorry. But it does help to explain why it is what I do. I mean, so to try to treat other people's religious traditions with respect.
I do have one more. Having studied the writings of the New Testament inside and out,
Yeah.
What has Jesus become to you?
Well, he started out as an interesting Jewish teacher, and if he's become anything, he's become more interesting. Because the more you know about the historical context, the better you can understand what his words would have sounded like to the people who first heard them, who are not people who are worshiping as Lord and Savior and don't think he's going to die. They think he's got some sort of credibility because he's a healer and he's an exorcist. And he's got a nice and quite arresting way of using rhetoric. I mean, this gets us to the what are called the words of institution. Eat, this is my body. Like, people are going to pay attention to that. So he has a very interesting way of teaching. And in much of his teaching, he repurposes stuff that's already in the culture, but presents it in a new way. for my Christian friends, they describe it as kind of like being at a revival where you hear stuff you've heard all the time, but suddenly you hear it new. Because it's a different voice saying it, and it's a different way of expressing what you've heard before, or perhaps a different time in your own life that you begin to hear something differently or hear something new. So he started as a really interesting teacher. He's an even more interesting teacher.
All right, thank you. We're going to get to the more provocative questions now.
Now that,
Charles can turn his microphone on.
is it on now? Yeah, it's on now. AJ, thank you. Yeah, so talking about Jesus's teaching or ministry that you just kind of highlighted in the previous question, we have the Last Supper, all right? We have the Last Supper. That's the last meal that Jesus shared with his original 12 disciples. And so for us here at St. Stephen, if we are trying to discern what God wants us to do, and if Jesus is God's conduit for us here at St. Stephen, the Last Supper is an important event for us to kind of understand. So my question is, do you have any thoughts as to how Jesus himself saw the Last Supper in the context of his ministry? And then kind of a question 1B is, can we understand how the original disciples took their experience of the Last Supper as that experience is kind of reflected in New Testament writings?
Yeah. I have to back up on your question because we technically have two Last Suppers. We have the Last Supper more or less the same in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and that gets also, the words of institution also get repeated in 1 Corinthians. But we also have the Last Supper in the Gospel of John, which is the foot washing scene. So even when you talk about what the Last Supper would have meant to the disciples, we have to figure out which Last Supper we're talking about. In terms of Christology, in terms of a focus on Jesus, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke and Paul version gets you the sense of the memorial feast. And I think those words would have shocked the first century followers. And John gives us a hint of that. So although there are no words of institution in the Johannine Last Supper, if you go to what's called the Bread of Life Discourse in John chapter 6, this is right after the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus says, unless you eat my body and drink my blood, you'll have no part of me. And the disciples are going, excuse me? That's difficult. Exactly so. And good for John that he voices that from the disciples. So if anybody's hearing that later, whether in the 1st century or the 21st century, you're supposed to sit up and take notice. So if somebody says, this is my body, you just don't say, fine, pass the cracker. You're supposed to think about that as profound and disturbing and shattering. So what's happened as this ritual has been repeated over and over again in the church, it becomes kind of pro forma. And people don't think about the words. Same thing with like the Our Father prayer. And I think these words are meant to be, I was about to say chewed on, and I really didn't mean to pun here, but I do think we're supposed to think about them. The German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach said many years ago, you are what you eat. And this is that sense back then is, what are you taking into yourself? What are you ingesting? So it's not just what are you remembering, which is Jesus' death on the cross, but what are you taking into yourself? A sense of martyrdom, a sense of the importance of the human body. I mean, like flesh, and flesh means not just body, but it means flesh, with like hair follicles and skin cells and epithelials, whatever. So it means the body is important. What you take into yourself, that's important too. So how does it change you when you eat and when you drink? And it should make you feel different. All of that stuff goes missing because it's too popular, right? I think for the disciples, the saying, take, eat, this is my body, drink, this is my blood, that would have been disturbing. I think for the disciples, the action of the washing of the feet would have been more disturbing. Because often what you do is more disturbing than what you say, right? Because you can say pretty much anything, but when you actually do something. And for these disciples to see this person they look at as their teacher, the authority, And Christology views of Jesus in the Gospel of John are very, very high compared to the Synoptics. To see him taking off his robe, wrapping a towel around his waist, getting on his knees and washing their feet, that would have been unthinkable. And one of the things about Jesus as teacher is he makes you think the unthinkable. And if you can think the unthinkable, then it becomes possible. Well, if somebody with this amount of authority can take on the role of somebody who's enslaved, because that's generally who would wash your feet, then what does it mean in terms of personal giving up of will, giving up of self, serving other people? That would have been the more striking.
All right, my mic is back on, I think. Let's look at the first rendition of the Last Supper, having the basis for the Eucharist. We've learned a word, Paschal, right? Paschal, and I understand that in several European languages, the word for Easter derives from the word Paschal.
Yeah.
As opposed to English, where our word Easter, I think, comes from the name of a pagan goddess, but that may be
a Druid goddess. Isn't that fun?
Yeah,
That's
that
where
may
the
be
bunnies
another-
and the jelly beans come from too.
Another story. But the word Paschal comes from the Greek word for Passover. And I may be mispronouncing it. I certainly can't read the Greek on my sheet here, but is it Pascha? Is that correct?
Yeah, it's Pascha.
All right. So what is the connection between the Last Supper and the Seder, the traditional Passover meal?
Yeah, so a couple of things. Pascha can also mean something like to suffer. Part of that comes into the idea of passion. So you've got a nice pun working doubly here. In terms of the Passover meal in Judaism is called a Seder. The word Seder in Hebrew, S-E-D-E-R, means order, because it's a choreographed meal, which is what the Eucharist is. It's a choreographed meal where whoever's presiding says a few things, does something, whether you're using a wafer, whether you're using bread, but it's usually broken. It's blessed, it's distributed. So if you think about the Eucharist as a choreographed meal, the Passover Seder is a choreographed meal, except it's a full dinner, which is probably what it would have been in the early Pauline churches. That's what Paul suggests in 1 Corinthians. The Seder, as it's celebrated today, is primarily a post-70 rabbinic invention. We don't have any early texts of the Seder. We start getting really clear Seder material about the 9th or 10th century. So it's relatively late. The rabbis talk about what it is, but the actual script, we start getting copies of that much later. It was developed in part because the Jews were unable to celebrate the Passover as it was celebrated at the time of Jesus. So at the time of Jesus, Passover is one of 3 pilgrimage festivals, along with Shavuot, which is your Pentecost. It commemorates, it's the spring harvest, but it's also the time traditionally that Moses gave people Torah from Mount Sinai. And the 3rd pilgrimage festival is in the fall. It's the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Sukkot. So what would happen if you were a first century Jew like Jesus, wherever you were, if you could make it to Jerusalem, you went to Jerusalem. So the city would swell to over 1 million people. And we have accounts of this from the first century Jewish historian Josephus. So we have a sense of how many people were there. You would get a lamb that was sacrificed in the temple. You would roast it. And that night, you and your family would eat that lamb. And you were supposed to eat the lamb within the environs of the city of Jerusalem. In other words, you don't get it like to go. You can't like pick it up from the temple and take it back to Galilee. So there are a lot of rented rooms. This was fairly common throughout the Roman Empire. You can find them actually in Pompeii. If you go to the ruins of Pompeii, there are like rental dining rooms. So you would rent a room. That's where this whole thing about, Jesus tells his disciples, go find a place to prepare the Passover, right? That means they got to go get the lamb, but they also got to get the rest of the food and they got to rent the room. And you would eat the Passover lamb. You would also eat, and this goes back to the time of Jesus, you would eat unleavened bread. It's called matzah, to commemorate that, according to the book of Exodus, when the enslaved Israelites are leaving Egypt, It kind of comes at the last minute, so they don't have enough time for the dough to rise. So they bake this flatbread, unleavened bread, and you eat bitter herbs. And the bitter herbs remind you of slavery in Egypt. So you have the Passover lamb that symbolizes the original Passover lamb sacrificed. And in that original Passover, and only then, they put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their house, so that the angel of death would see that and like pass over. And that's where you get this idea of the angel of death passing over the houses of the Israelites. They don't do that. Was a one-off, right? Jews aren't putting blood on their doorposts these days. The bitter herbs to remind you of slavery, the matzah to remind you of the Exodus. That's what it was. So what happens for the Synoptic Gospels and Paul is that the ceremony gets repurposed. Not only is it a Passover celebration, but for Paul, Jesus is actually our Passover, as he puts it, so that the Passover lamb eventually becomes, in John's Gospel, Jesus. Right at the beginning of John's Gospel, John the Baptizer says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And then when you get to this idea of the Passover lambs, like boom. So the Passover lamb gets repurposed as symbolic of Jesus. And the escape from slavery becomes symbolically then repurposed into the escape from sin and death. So that the death of the new Paschal offering, Jesus, is what protects people from death again, but also protects them from sin, or at least gets them a do-over. So what we've got with the Last Supper is what religions always do. Religions are, unless they die out, religions change over time, they develop, and rituals get new meaning and new purposes. So that for the early followers of Jesus who were Jewish, they would have done this Passover meal, but they also would have recognized that Jesus died at Passover time. Whether the Last Supper was a Passover meal or not is highly debated. I don't think it was. It's not in the Gospel of John. I think John's chronology makes more sense here, but it was more or less the same time. So they said, well, how do we understand our history in light of the Christ event? And they went back to their Bible. They wouldn't have called it the Old Testament because there's no New Testament yet. But they went back to their text and said, where do I see Jesus here? How do I reread this text in light of the cross and the resurrection? And they landed on the book of Exodus and said, this is a place where I see new meaning in light of how I understand the Christ.
AJ, when we study the Bible, especially the Gospels, sometimes we try to find an aha moment. In other words, why are they different? And we focus ourselves on why they're different. And rather than taking issue with the 5 portrayals of the Last Supper as different, you say we should embrace them all 5, including John. Why do you recommend this approach?
Yeah. First of all, memory is pretty fluid, even in traditionally oral cultures. So Blue Cross Blue Shield, God bless them, sent a nurse practitioner to our house to check to see that my husband and I were still sane. So they start with, they give you 3 words and they say, remember these words, because at the end we're going to check your memory, right? Like orange bookcase and chair, I think. Good, I can still remember them. If people back then, if somebody made a pronouncement, you kind of remembered the skeletal outline, but you didn't remember the exact words. When I lecture, even if my students are taking notes, when I get comments back on papers and exams, I'm thinking, boy, I didn't say that, right? So first of all, we have to recognize that memory is fragile. And if we start trying to get back to figure out exactly what Jesus said, we're never going to get there anyway. So trying to get to that original whatever is a futile exercise. Moreover, Jesus spoke Aramaic, the Gospels are written in Greek. So everything gets lost to some extent when you translate from one word to the other. I think it was brilliant on the part of the people who put the New Testament together to give us 5 different versions. Because it's like looking at a sculpture through different angles, and each time you look at it, it seems different. Or even at a really good oil painting, if you catch it from the side, it's going to look different than you look at it straight on. or even your friends, see them early in the morning or late at night, they're going to look different. So I think what the text is doing is allowing the readers to zoom in differently and get different perspectives on this material. What could be more helpful? Because it doesn't lock Jesus into a box. It doesn't lock the story into a box, but it says you've got various ways of approaching this. And sometimes certain words are going to have more meaning than other words, or certain expressions will have more meaning than other expressions. Do we talk about a covenant in the blood, or do we talk about a new covenant in the blood? And some will find that the old covenant language helpful. Others will say new covenant. Oh, that's like Jeremiah. Let's go read Jeremiah chapter 31. Some will say, well, maybe we should go to John 6 and look at the bread of life discourse, and then we can understand the Last Supper language in light of the feeding of the 5,000 and the sense of enormous generosity and how many people are participating in this meal. Or we can go to 1 Corinthians, where Paul says, listen, this is supposed to be a meal for everybody. And in this system, everybody's supposed to be equal. And we're not going to count gender, and we're not going to count who's enslaved and who's a free person and who's a patrician. And we're not going to count whether you grew up in a Jewish household or you grew up in a pagan household. And it turns out in Corinth that the richer people are coming to the dinner first and they're chowing down. And when the poorer people or the enslaved people finally get there, there's not enough food. And Paul says, you know what? You guys are chowing down on this, and this is supposed to be a sacred meal. And that's why many of you were sick and some of you have died. Boy, let's take that seriously. So we've got allusions to Exodus. We've got allusions to Jeremiah. We've got the practical. Who's there? Who gets to come first? Are people judging you? So churches do Eucharist differently. Some church, you come up front. Some church it's distributed, right? But what happens, and I'm in churches a lot. So what happens if you're a coming up front church? You're watching people's clothes. You're seeing how well they're dressed. You're seeing who gets to sit up front and who is sitting in the back. And then suddenly people start judging. But then when you look at the language in Paul and the language in John, boy, that tells you don't do that. And when you start thinking about judging, well, the synoptics are pretty clear that Judas is at the Last Supper. So who gets to come? Is it only for the perfect people, or is it for sinners? And who is welcome? And why is it that some people who are distributing kind of look at some folks, as some conservative churches and some Catholic churches, and say, oh, no, you can't come because you're divorced, or you can't come because you had an abortion. Saying, well, Judas makes it in. So even with all these different versions, for me, at least, they continue to hit up against contemporary ritual. What do you experience when you go to the church? And it may be for me, it's different because I'm not participating. I'm sitting back in the pew and watching. And you can get a sense of what people think of the Eucharist by watching their faces. Is there a transformative moment between the time they go up and the time they come back? And there should be. And there will be if people think about what they're doing.
Okay. Jesus, for example, says in John, did I not choose you, the 12? Yet one of you is the devil. The Son of Man goes as is written of him, but woe to the one whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Mm-hmm. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. That's pretty harsh language.
Yes.
And obviously Jesus was upset, right?
Well,
you say though it's up to the reader to determine what to make of those statements. What do you make of those statements?
So when I wrote the book on Mark, I did a whole half a chapter on Judas. I'm not sure Jesus was upset because in the Gospel of John, Jesus is remarkably stoic. He tends to direct everything. He knows exactly what's going to happen. And for John, it is what it is. So I'm not sure he's upset. I think he's just saying, this is the way it is. And what are you going to do? John is a fairly predestinarian gospel. You're either saved because you were called to be saved, or you're damned because you weren't. And in this case, what your Calvinist friends on the other side of the Protestant spectrum would call double predestination. You can only come to Jesus if you get called. Well, what happens if you don't? Was Judas fated to do this? Today, many of us find this difficult. I mean, I find it difficult. In the first century, it might have been less so. They had a philosophical notion in both parts of early Judaism and in parts of Roman philosophy and Stoicism. The technical term for this is compatibilism. And compatibilism means everything is predetermined and you still have free will. Now, this gives me a headache because I studied religion, not philosophy. But the idea that everything is predetermined, this had to happen, but you still have free will. So even though it had to happen, you had a choice in the matter. And I think that's what's being reflected in the Gospel of John. A very famous rabbi from the Mishnah named Rabbi Akiva, who was put to death by the Romans about a century after Jesus, around 135 or so, is reputed to have said, all is determined and free will is given, which is just another way of talking about compatibilism. For some people, the idea that it was just that way, it actually makes them feel hopeful. And where I got this sense of hope is from teaching in a maximum security institute. So until COVID, I was fairly often teaching courses or going out and sitting in on other people's courses at Riverbend Maximum Security Institute, which is the men's max prison here in Nashville. It's where Tennessee's death row is still located because Tennessee is still executing people. And for some of my students, they weren't talking about themselves. They were talking about other people in the prison. They were saying, this guy's just a sociopath. He's just pure evil. And there's nothing you can do about him. And it makes them feel like they didn't fail in trying to get him redeemed. I mean, they're still working on it, but they said there's some people are just pure evil. And it would be better for them had they not been born. Today, we would call that sociopathy. People who don't have a conscience and would just happily kill somebody just as they'd swat a fly, they'd strangle somebody. So for people who have tried to rescue folks who simply cannot be rescued, or parents who have done their best to raise, morally conscious kids and the kids aren't, maybe this gives some sense of, sometimes you can keep trying, but there may be nothing you can do. That's a hard lesson, but it makes me think. Right? I prefer the synoptic version. In Matthew, and only in Matthew, after Judas hears that Jesus has been arrested and he realizes that Jesus is going to die, he throws the money back in the temple and he hangs himself. So he commits suicide. It doesn't say he repented, but I think what he's feeling is that guilt. And I'm wondering if we're supposed to see everybody in the image and likeness of God, can we recognize that image and likeness also in Judas? Can we see despair? Can we see guilt? My guys in prison say, would you want to be judged by the worst thing you've ever done? And that's how Judas has been judged. On the other hand, up until that final week in Jerusalem, he looked like except for the Gospel of John, which says he was skimming the books, he looked like a pretty decent disciple. So I think what Judas does is he captures our moral conscience. And John gives us one way of looking at him, and Matthew gives us a different way. And according to Paul, to make this even more difficult, when Paul talks about the night that Jesus was handed over, the Greek word handed over, paradidomi, can also mean betray, because you hand over something. It's also the word for tradition. You hand over something from, father to son or mother to daughter. When Paul talks about Jesus being paradidomied, the person who paradidomies Jesus is God the Father. It's God the Father who hands Jesus over to the cross. That gives a different way of looking at things. Do we need a Judas? Do we need a scapegoat?
Thank you, AJ. You've spoken a good bit about, the significance of the Last Supper, the Eucharist, the Holy Communion, the Lord's Supper, however we characterize it in today's Christianity. And you remind us in your book that our partaking of Holy Communion poses a risk to us. We have a risk when we go to the table. Can you describe what that risk is, and so we can be mindful of that?
Oh yeah. But it's not like in the Pauline sense that if you do something in a profane way, you're going to drop dead. I mean, so that's more mythological thinking. But it's a risk of hypocrisy. How can you participate in this supper, which is established by somebody who's about to die, who's about to give up his life, and who prior to the Last Supper narratives in the Gospels has been teaching about ethics and morality? How can you participate in this and then not go out and live what he asked you to live? How can you ingest this and not have it transform you? So there's a risk of hypocrisy. There's a risk of taking lightly something that is enormously profound. There's a risk of profaning the tradition. In antiquity, it was a risk of being caught participating in a ritual that people thought on the outside was some sort of cannibalism. So there's a risk of actually saying to yourself each time, what am I doing? What do I think I'm doing? Or am I just following the parade up? And I think it's always a risk, and it's an inevitable risk for those who participate in ritual to let it become just a dead metaphor and not really to think about this. I mean, I can see the same thing in celebrating the Passover, because it's a meal we Jews look forward to every year because it's a time to get together with family. And my husband bakes his mother's brisket, which is great. And we have all sorts of food that we don't get, like matzo ball soup, which I really like once a year. And you get into the food and you forget that there are still people who are enslaved, right? So whenever we participate in a ritual, there's a risk of that ritual becoming dead and no longer being meaningful. You got to think about it. And as soon as ritual goes on automatic, it's dead.
All right, thank you. And so I'd like to at least finish our questions, that is from Alan and me this morning, AJ, going back to the foot washing in John's portrayal of the Last Supper, because for our summer study series, again, trying to discern what God wants us to do, and Jesus being the conduit to God for us. You write in connection with the foot washing in John, you quote Jesus saying, "For I have set you an example," the foot washing, "that you should do as I have done to you." And then you go on to kind of characterize foot washing as an example of servant leadership. And you state in your book, the idea of servant leadership was, I think, a hallmark of Jesus' teaching, and it certainly was a hallmark of his early followers. So if we're trying here, AJ, at St. Stephen, to discern what God's calling us to do, how does foot washing, how does servant leadership fit in with that call?
Yeah, thank you, because I think that's a really important question. How do you serve others? And not just people in your own group, right? So once you start this idea of serving others, then questions of class consciousness come about. So how do you serve others and at the same time make them feel welcome, as opposed to, I'm the rich person, you're the poor person, and I'm going to give you some charity? Because that reinstantiates this class-based distinction. You know, you're the poor, I'm the rich, or something. How do you serve others without thinking about your own importance? How do you serve others by allowing yourself more or less to be emptied, so that you pour yourself out? This, Paul would call this kenosis, like it's Jesus emptying out divinity. I'm in Philippians chapter 2 here. He empties out divinity. He takes on the role of an enslaved individual. How do you give up your authority? How do you give up your class? How do you give up your status and say, it doesn't matter where you live or what your bank account is, we're all part of the same servant group. We lead not by telling people what to do, but by listening to others and figuring out what their needs are rather than telling them. How do you get around the, oh, I'm too good to do that? when other people would be happy to have that particular position. How do you recognize people who are serving you? And this is like the folks who typically don't get noticed, like who cleans up the sanctuary after the service and who stays to say thank you? You know, who cleans up the kitchen? Who does the maintenance? Who takes care of the grounds? And how do you make these people who are part of your community feel like they're part of your community? What could you do for them that would be welcome? So all of these questions are part of what it means to be a servant leader. However, we also have another risk here, lots of risk. Jesus is not only taking the role of a servant, he's taking the role of a slave. And given what we know about the legacy of slavery, I mean, I here in Tennessee, you there in North Carolina, can we still use this metaphor? Or do we have to figure out some other metaphor? Servanthood is voluntary. Slavery is not. So can we even use this language? Or do we have to find some other terminology? Maybe, and John is helpful here, maybe terminology of siblings, brothers and sisters, or friends. And what do friends do? They help each other and they serve each other, and they're all of the same class. So we've got a bunch of options here. And because charisms are different, because different people have different spiritual gifts, each individual member of the congregation, each individual Christian will have to figure out what am I being called so that I can take the servant leadership, put my own ego aside, and get into the mess of humanity, and do something that would be helpful and that would be welcome. So I may not worship Jesus as Lord and Savior, but boy, he was spot on for that one.
Good. Thank you, AJ. We appreciate your thoughts this morning. Now, Alan, do you want to see if we have folks in the audience who may have a question
We'll
for
take
Dr. Levine?
Yeah, we got time for some questions. Anybody? I see one back here.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
No, I had just a question about going back to the Last Supper. Why do you think there was a Last Supper? You know, Jesus said, "Do this in remembrance of me," but I kept thinking while you were talking, there's plenty to remember that happened after that. I mean, there's the crucifixion, there's the resurrection, there's the great commissioning. I mean, you could have skipped straight to that, and that would be what you remembered. Why do you think it's the Last Supper we're supposed to remember?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think it's part of human nature to want ritual, to want a sense of how do I recollect this in the best way possible? And how can I, in a ritual, also be a participant therein? So the Last Supper gives us all of that, and it gives it within a sense of community. So it's not like Jesus said to Peter, take this. It's Jesus said to the 12. So it establishes a way of the congregation to come together, be physically in the presence of Jesus, with the sense of the eating and the drinking, and you think body and blood, and that catches you up short. So I think the idea of ritual is in part why this took on such in effect, a life of its own. And then it does take on a life of its own, because when you start looking over the past 2,000 years of Christianity, you have transubstantiation and consubstantiation and memorial feasts, and you've got it every week, and you've got it every day, and you've got it 4 times a year, or you've got it first Sunday or whatever. So different churches are trying to figure out how to do this thing. But I think the ritual nature was super important, and I think Jesus recognized that. Another point, the Last Supper is a culmination of his work, particularly in the Synoptic Gospels, but also in John, considering that he is consistently meeting people at table. So when you have this Last Supper, you got to remember like the first several, whether it's the first supper at Holy Week, which is at least according to Matthew and Mark, when the woman anoints Jesus' head. And I want that to be a Christian celebration too, because the story is supposed to be told in memory of her. You remember the feeding of the 5,000, or in Matthew and Mark, the feeding of the 4,000 as well. You remember in Luke, the dining with tax collectors and sinners. You remember the dining with Pharisees. So every time you sit down to the table, it's as if there's like Jesus is there in the next seat. And then you can really bring that to the fore, not when you're at your home table, but when you're within that congregation and you're sitting together with people who are what anthropologists would call part of your fictive kinship group, your brothers and sisters in Christ. So yeah, it made sense to remember it because it's a repeatable ritual. It's one that evokes all those other feedings. It's one that keeps the congregation together. And it's one by which, I mean, you can look at a cross, but you can't ingest it. And I think that ingesting is really important. You just kind of take it into your body. If you were a first century pagan, by the way, this would have remind you of meals dedicated to the god Dionysus, the wine god, where you ingest the body of Dionysus. It sounds kind of weird to us, but that's what they thought back then.
Any other questions?
Isn't it wonderful when questions open up to like half a dozen different answers? And that's typical for the Bible. I mean, my students say, well, is it this or is it that? And I typically say it's both, right? So there are multiple reasons why these things are remembered, and there are multiple takeaways from what we do remember.
Well, I think just like your students, AJ, everything was crystal clear.
Well, if something isn't, you can always come back and ask again,
Right.
or you can email me. Yeah.
All right. Well, AJ, again, thank you. Again, thank you for your valuable time, your thoughts, your enlightenment of us, giving your perspective on these really significant issues, right? Again, so again, thank you. Wish you well in your continued professional and family endeavors there in Nashville. So what are we left with, right? What are we left with this summer? We're left with, what are we going to do with what we've learned and discerned during our summer study series? How do we take on servant leadership? What's God calling us to do? And you may recall from Will Williman's visit with us, he had the image of the circuit rider, right? The old Methodist circuit rider back in the day would go out, right? Go out to the people, go out to where they lived and worked and played, right? So how can we become modern day circuit riders? So again, thank you for your time today. Thank you again, Dr. Levine.